It looks like Kaisa is actually spearheading the Chinese metagame, which is very different from what we have in Europe and Americas. In the past week, we had 8 city challenges happening in China, and in 6 of them, we had at least one Kaisa in the top 8, but not only that, 2 of them were also being won by Kaisas. What's even more shocking is that in those tournaments, Kaisa had been the top 2 most popular deck. Are we back in Origins? So let's take a look at the deck lists that are performing. I'm going to tell you why they are sitting well in the metagame and what are the choices that the players are doing in China to actually elevate the deck. So let's start with Shenzhen City Challenge that was won by Kaisa, but also was the 7th place. It had 128 players, so it was the 2nd most popular deck at the tournament with 11 entries. Now remember, City Challenges do not have the incentive of playing different legends because there are no plated legends for performing with those, right? So you just have naturally divided metagame, and as you can see here, it's pretty still like wide, what you would typically consider like any other card game, right? And the most popular deck was 10% Irelia, which is 14 entries, so just a little bit above 10% actually. And the 3rd place was Master Yi with 9 entries, while Cannon was the top 4, which is very different from what we see in Europe and in NA, where basically Cannon is like way above anything else, which is very interesting. So this is the winner's deck list that I think is pretty well constructed, so I'm gonna be using it as the first example, and you can literally just take it and play with it and you're gonna see what's going on. So what are the changes in this deck list that we didn't see before? Even though those are not new cards, but they were not utilized in Kaisa before, like Rockfall Path and Frozen Fortress. Now both of them have synergy with cards in the deck. Like if you never played Kaisa, TLDR, you play small creatures, you play efficient removal, you get points by sacrificing the smallest possible creatures, so you get like a very little investment for your points when you just exchange it for smaller creatures, right? So you're just trying to spawn camp with like removal like Falling Stars and Singularities, and then efficiently trade with the opponent and be always ahead on points essentially, right? So that's like the big game plan. Now the thing is, Frozen Fortress is essentially another copy of Voidgate, because you're gonna be able to deal additional damage to units that are standing on it, right? But it also has another function that I'm going to tell you again with something over here, Brynhir. We're going to be talking about that when it comes to Brynhir. Now, Rockfall Path is being played in Kaisa because quite literally it just is enabled by Temporal Breach, the newest card from Vendetta. That is like one of the cards that actually is being played so much in Vendetta. And if you have seen the video about how to upgrade Kaisa that I released last week, you're gonna know that this is one of the things that I was talking about. Now, Temporal Breach on Rockfall Path is essentially a free removal, right? It's also reaction speed if you're gonna be hiding there when you just control it. But it's just, you can just play it on your own turn and just kill something that is on the Rockfall Path, which is very efficient, right? So your opponent has to be very aware to not put big creatures on Rockfall Path because you're gonna get wrecked. Voidgate, self-explanatory, so whatever, right? And now let's talk about the biggest like triangle of effect that comes here into Kaisa. Basically, because we play the Rockfall Path Temporal Breach, we're trying to find a triangle of synergy that allows us to be more efficient with our card draws and possibilities in our hands, right? So we have Rockfall Path, Temporal Breach, but also now Brynhir combo with Temporal Breach, so we are not just tied to playing Temporal Breach in the game when we only play Rockfall Path, but we also have Temporal Breach combo with Thousand Tail Watcher and Temporal Breach combo with Lecturing Yordle, right? Of course, the Lecturing Yordle is like the smallest one. It does give you the option to just draw an additional card. You can also use it to like heal units or like stuff like that. It's very niche, but you get the point. Anyway, the biggest synergy is obviously Brynhir and Thousand Tail Watcher. Replaying Brynhir allows you to get the effect of when you play Brynhir, so which doesn't allow your opponent to essentially play cards. Now, because typically the only deck that could allow you to use Brynhir when your opponent during your opponent's turn to not allow to play card in his turn is Rengar, because he had the reaction speed signature. Now you can kind of mimic that in Kaisa, which is basically Temporal Breach on Frozen Fortress with Brynhir, right? Because you don't need to have Brynhir on your Frozen Fortress. It can be on the other battlefield with a hidden Temporal Breach, because Frozen Fortress always triggers at the beginning of the turn, and when it triggers you have the possibility of reacting to it, right? So you're gonna be able to replay your Brynhir and essentially get the combo off during your opponent's turn before his essentially quote-unquote main phase, where he could play creatures, they could play creatures or action spells or slow speed spells. What's also interesting that Rockfall Path is also pretty decent in current metagame, where Ranga is being perceived as one of the best decks because of Prismat, although I don't think it's one of the best decks. It's very solid, don't get me wrong, but I think it's very hard to pilot. Anyway, my point is, Rockfall Path works against all of the ambush units, right? It works against, well, LeBlanc is not in the metagame, so you should probably not be thinking about that, but overall, so many people are playing Temporal Breaches that many people just play Rockfall Path, which naturally works also in your favor because you play Temporal Breaches, so you can see like how this kind of is like a weird world where the player who is more aware how to play Temporal Breaches might just be winning because of that. And also remember that Temporal Breaching your 1000 Tail Watcher when it's on the, like in any location, gives you the -3, right, which you can combine with damage that is already being dealt first, so you can like try to deal damage with something, with like Hextech Ray or Bellows Breath, and then if opponent doesn't respond with like a counter spell or something, then you just blink your own 1000 Tail Watcher and the units just die, right? Which is pretty solid. And also remember, when you're blinking your 1000 Tail Watcher, you can pay the accelerate cost to essentially ready the unit, right? Which is like, you can basically have like another finisher, right? Because you're gonna be, actually it doesn't matter when I think about it, because you're not gonna be able to like reposition yourself from like battlefield to base. So it will only help if you have like ganking. So like the games where it's like Hillock, for example, you're gonna be able to like attack with 1000 Tail Watcher to a battlefield like the Hillock, then blink it, accelerate it again, and go to the other battlefield. But yeah, pretty niche scenario. Never mind, I just talked myself out of that. Other newer cards that we have here in this deck are things like, for example, Brittle Steel, which could be a perfect execution instead. I feel like there's one of this flex spot that you can have just to have the possibility of either being more aggressive or being more prepped against the gear, right? So perfect execution of Brittle Steel is one of those flex spots. Then we have Eclipse, which could be Smokescreen just because of the more efficient cost, but at the same time, not having the power cost in Eclipse is actually a very big deal, because you're gonna be able to combine it with another piece of removal that typically will cost you power, right? So you're not gonna be losing that, even though it costs a little bit more energy. And the Predict is actually way more valuable than you put like if you just think about it. Most people just dismiss predict value, but it's actually not the reality. Predicting the card and just seeing like a shitty 2-drop at the top and just putting on the bottom actually means a lot. So I really like Eclipse. It also combines with Frozen Fortress, because when a unit has damage on it, so let's say there's a Noxus Hopeful on Frozen Fortress, it gets dealt 1 damage, now you can just Eclipse it and kill it. This would also work with, for example, Zed, which has 5 might, because it gets the 1 damage, then you do -4 with Eclipse, it goes to 1 might, it has 1 damage on it, so it dies, right? So that's another small like synergy that you can have in your deck. And the 1 Sprite Burst is just a very efficient way of finishing the game with just 1 card if you need the double points and you cleared up the battlefields first, right? So other than that, this is pretty standard, like what you would expect. Maybe typically would expect like more Bellows Breaths or more Singularities, but I feel like that really depends on the way that you want to play the deck. Those numbers could be shifted, right? And the deck, why is this deck performing? Like, that's the main question. How is it being put into the metagame? So let's go to riftmeta.net and take a look at what I would say are the matchups for Kaisa against specific top decks. Let's start with Draven midrange. I would say this is a favorite matchup for Kaisa, because you're gonna be able to remove the threats without going into combat, which is very important to avoid the core draw from Draven, right? You're gonna be also able to essentially spawn camp, and the only way that Draven can play around that is either using star crosses, but you don't have really big units that he would be like, you know, fun, like having fun bouncing, right? Because you don't play Ferrous Forerunners in your main typically, in the sideboard, right? So Starcross is not the best choice. And then the other thing that you can do is using the reaction signature weapons, right? Which gives you +3. Now, if you have this in mind and you're gonna be able to outplay with like an additional removal, the units are being then buffed by the weapon, you're gonna essentially also take the biggest threat, which is the weapon, from the hand of the Draven as well, because you just have multiple removal spells, right? So this is like pretty significant matchup for Kaisa that is pretty good. And also Draven sees up in popularity, which makes Kaisa a decent choice into this metagame, right? Then we have Diana midrange, which is, in my opinion, insanely favorite for Kaisa. Like, Diana absolutely hates direct removal. She doesn't really have a way of boosting the HP, the might of the units at reaction speed. So like, essentially a Diana with 3 might just dies to almost anything. You have Hueys which just die to Singularity or Falling Stars, and you cannot do anything. That's why Rek'Sai also likes the Diana matchup, because they use almost similar kind of tools. It's either gonna be the Falling Stars or the Cool the Weeks, and Diana doesn't really have much to do about that unless it's tentacles against Cool the Weak. But overall, Kaisa doesn't have this problem. You just have more direct removal, which makes it very favorable, right? Against Cannon Miracle, the only problem is that the recurring threats are an issue, but Kaisa, I would say, because the removal is so efficient, you should be at least like at a 50-50 against Cannon Miracle, which is already pretty decent. But I would say, depending on your build, you can make it even better. So I would perceive this matchup also as kinda positive. Against LeBlanc Hook, historically speaking, this is not a good matchup for Kaisa, but I also think it got a little bit better because of the Temporal Breach and Rockfall Path being there, and a lot more Bryn Hears being played in the deck. So I wouldn't say it's super negative for Kaisa, but at the same time, you probably should never like even think about your matchup into LeBlanc Hook, because it's such an unpopular deck, right? Then against Irelia, this should be a hard matchup for Kaisa, probably the worst one because of the Deflect, and we will see some Kaisa lists actually playing some tools against Irelias in the deck list, but also the Akali Silent becomes such a big nuisance for Kaisa decks, because they are immune to Falling Stars and they're immune to Singularities, right? So you would need to use action spells to try to kill the Akali Silent, which is not easy to do when they are like buffed to like minimum 6 essentially, right? So Irelia still is one of the most challenging matchups for Kaisa. Then we have Rek'Sai, which I think is a positive matchup for Kaisa. Also depends like how many Bellows Breath you play, but Frozen Fortress is very annoying for Rek'Sai, for example. You're gonna be able to utilize your removal very efficiently, right? So I feel like it's positive for Kaisa, even though Rek'Sai has a lot of threats because they play such a wide board. I think Kaisa can be very efficient with that, and because she's gonna be able to build up the energy like way more efficiently than Rek'Sai, you're gonna be able to get on top, and you probably would side out Temporal Breaches in this particular matchup to just get even more removal from your sideboard and play Ferris Forerunners maybe. Although, yeah, you would probably play Ferris Forerunners against Rek'Sai. Then against Azir, I would say, now, typically, I would not advise to play Thermal Beam anymore in this metagame, because you're going to be able to play the Brittle Steel, which I think is just way more efficient for Kaisa, because you're gonna be able to use it earlier, not pay the power cost, and then utilize it from trash. So even without Thermal Beam in the sideboard, I think if you have multiple Brittle Steels, you're gonna have a positive matchup into Azir, because the thing, how I perceive this matchup is this: Thermal Beam wrecks Azir, like no question asked, right? You're gonna be able to like destroy 4 or 5 pieces of equipment. Azir probably just folds, right? But the thing is, Azir will be playing very aggressively against Kaisa, so they're going to be playing the Arises as soon as possible, even when it's not fully optimal, because they could be more greedy with the equipment that they have in hand, but they're going to be less greedy because of that, which makes the matchup a little bit harder for Kaisas, because now Azir is like a little bit more head-on, I would say. But if you play Brittle Steels, you're going to be able to combat the Azirs within like that aggressive tempo, which I think is a big change. And I think actually Brittle Steel is much stronger into Azir than Thermal Beams, because you're going to be able to just, they play a BF sword, you pay 2 energy, no power, you destroy it. That's incredibly strong. And your Azir opponent has to do a defy and pay a power cost to make sure that that doesn't happen, right? But then you have next turn, because probably not the same turn, but next turn, you're going to be able to play the Brittle Steel again for the 4 energy and 1 power cost to destroy that BF, and most likely there's not gonna be an additional copy of Defy for that, right? And also you can draw more copies of Brittle Steel and be that aggressor essentially to combat Azir's typical game plan. So I feel like really Brittle Steel is just so much better in this matchup than Thermal Beams, but that is like my gut feeling. I didn't play Kaisas in this matchup, but in my head those lines are happening like way more in a way more beneficial way for Kaisa than Azir. Against Master Yi, I would say this is not a good matchup. right? And you would need to you're probably just losing game 1 because you don't really have like typically like a massive amount of like Ferrous Forerunners and so on. But in post-board game 2 and 3, you're gonna be able to play Ferrous Forerunners and essentially also maybe have Decree of Insight to battle against Rengars, right? Is it Decree of Insight? Well, I mean the blue decrees that give bodies -5, right? But I don't think like that's maybe that necessary. But overall, I would perceive Master Yi as a negative win rate. Oh, why is it pink? I don't know. But let's remove that. It should be red. So in the top decks here, I don't know actually about Mel, right? It should be a... Here we go. In the top decks here, I just removed everything. Oh my god, I'm an idiot. Anyway, this is positive, this is positive, this is positive, this is like positive probably. This is neutral, this is negative, right? Here we go. So now, in the top decks, as you can see, you only have like 2 bad matchups. One is probably very bad, like Irelia, and the other one is like, it's like bad but not terrible, which is Master Yi, right? And then against Mel, I'll be honest with you, I have no idea. Like, I did not play yet against good Mel decks. Maybe I should ask Alan, but he's probably not going to do that before Barcelona, so I don't want to ask even. Anyway, the point is, I don't really know how's the matchup against Mel. It should be decent because it's Diana, but Rebuttal just completely wrecks you, like if it gets reversed, right? Falling Star getting reversed is like, it's abysmal, right? Singularity being reversed, it's abysmal as well. Like, you have to play around so many things. At the same, you know what? Now when I think about it though, if you play Brynn here, you play 3 Brynn here's, so you play Brynn here, Rebuttal is useless, and then suddenly the Mel deck just folds, right? Because you're not going to be able to do anything about the removal. You know what? Okay, I'm going to make a very on this spot, like, judgment of this matchup, and I would say it's probably Kaisa favorite because of the fact that you're going to be able to abuse Brynn here's, right? Maybe that's a good thing. So yeah, this would make the signature just completely useless in those turns, and then you are able to probably use Falling Stars to remove the threats from Mel. So maybe. So, but anyway, that would be like my initial assessment against the A tier decks, right? And then in the B tier, you have a positive win rate for sure against Kha'Zix. Well, maybe not for sure, but it's like, historically speaking, this is like very good matchup for Kaisa because you just have so much removal, and Kha'Zix would have to proactively remove your spells from your hand. So Sabotage and Decree of... Oh, you can remember the name yet. The Orange Decree that removes blue cards, right? So like the removing Singularities, removing like Watchers and so on would be very important, like Bellows Breaths. But overall, Kha'Zix, I would say it's still unfavorite into Kaisa. Against Lux Loop, this is probably not a good matchup, I would say. Like, you don't really like put a lot of pressure onto the boards. You have a lot of dead cards, so probably not a positive win rate into Lux Loop. So we're gonna mark this as red. Ezreal control is like, depends on your build, probably like a more 50-50. You have to be very reserved, and probably you need cards in the sideboard for this specific matchup. So I would probably set Ezreal control is negative, unless you have a board set up for that specific matchup. So I'm gonna, you know what? I'm gonna remove the blue and put it into red over here. Again, mistakes were made. Okay, here we go. So this is gonna be a red matchup. Rengar aggro is for sure positive for you. That's not even a question. Annie midrange positive for you as well, because the same issue as Draven midrange. It's like just even less bigger units apart from Ferrous Forerunner. So the only thing that Annie can do in this matchup from my perspective is just sticking a Ferrous Forerunner and having hard bargain in the same turn to just avoid, like, you know, being deleted essentially, right? Ambessa, I would say it's positive for Kaisa. Again, similar problems, right? Like, Ambessa's biggest problem is Starcross, but other than that, it's gonna be Singularities, right? So the only big units that are gonna be able to withstand the damage from Singularities and Falling Stars is gonna be your chosen unit. Everything else just simply dies. Set should be very negative. So, woohoo, that is not a good matchup, but who plays Set, right? And then the rest, like the random decks, that really depends. But it's not even that important, right? If you play in a tournament that doesn't have like the incentive to play for for the plated legends and so on, then you're gonna be meeting all of the top decks and not the bottom tier decks, which can be more random for Kaisa. So I would say Kaisa has really a lot of good matchups over here that you should be happy about. Now, Aurora matchup is definitely not something that you are happy to see, but let's just disregard Aurora, shall we? Like, it's still like, yeah. I mean, what can you do? If you play against Jay's Aurora and he goes Promising Day and you get a Bryn here, and at least they will not be able to play like the unit from Aurora that was going to be played on turn 2, so that's an upside. But other than that, you need to have a removal for that Aurora immediately, or otherwise you're just going to most likely fold. So it's probably not going to be an easy matchup as well. But yeah, I would say the overall impression that I have is Kaisa is a very good choice in this Vendetta metagame. Now let's go back to the lists from the same tournament. This is the 7th place. There are some changes over here, like for example, there are no Pouty Poros, there's just like one Ravenbloom student, and there is Heisho as the battlefield that replaces Voidgate, right? Which I kind of like and kind of dislike. I feel like this is a massive help against Irelia, but at the same time, Irelia doesn't have to stand on this battlefield a lot of the times, right? But it does help a little bit. I would probably still prefer Voidgate because it's just so much more help in every single matchup rather than just one. But I do understand, like I can see some of the decks are actually swapping Rockfall Path for Heisho, and I think that's a mistake. Like there's no way you're gonna be removing your Rockfall Path Temporal Breach combo from your deck, because that's just potentially too strong. And it's not about even like how many times you're actually gonna do it to do the breach on the Rockfall Path, because I don't feel like that's at least that relevant. It's just the way that it affects the game without even being cast, because your opponent will not put a big unit on Rockfall Path because he's gonna be worried about Temporal Breach, right? So that's a thing. The other big changes here in this particular list is like one more Bellows Breath, one less Bryn here, which I don't know if that's a good choice. There's instead one Ferrous Forerunner, right? I would probably prefer to have like 3 Bryn here's and just have Ferrous Forerunners in the sideboard, because your just entire combo is revolving around Temporal Breach, Bryn here's, and so on, right? Because remember, like if you play Bryn here and then you Temporal Breach something, the unit is removed. It doesn't get bounced back because it cannot be played, right? That's one of the big things that happens with Temporal Breach, because the unit is being played again, right? So not only Rockfall Path, but also the Bryn here, Thunder Song, right? So cutting the Bryn here is not something I would say is a great choice. Now, there's like one Icathian Rain. I don't know what to think about that. I love the card, don't get me wrong. I played so much Kaisa in Origins, and I love the Icathian Rain. I played like 2 copies always, every single time, even when the metagame wasn't really like favoring it. But I love the card and idea of it. So it's like a pet card for me. But it is playable. You know, we have both Brittle Steel and Perfect Execution over here, which I also very much like. I think Perfect Execution is very good. Your opponents will be playing like Zone Warrens, and some of the decks are gonna be doing like, you know, your random Bewitching Spirits and discarding your cards. Then Perfect Execution and Brittle Steel are perfect for that because of the flow. So there's enough relevant scenarios where Perfect Execution will actually matter a lot. And, you know, you're gonna be able to accelerate any of your units, like 9 energy, 2 power Ferrous Forerunner that enters ready and attacks for 9. That's pretty solid, you know, that's pretty solid, at least from my perspective. In the sideboard though, this is a card I hate. Decree of Rage, I feel like you will not be struggling as once if you were watching the Rift meta segment with the metagame. I don't feel like you need help against the green color, because the units that are gonna be meeting in the green color, like the only one that actually like would matter for Decree of Rage is gonna be Stellacorn Herder in base, and that's where Decree of Rage kind of helps. But at the same time, if your opponent has even 1 energy open, then suddenly Decree of Rage is gonna be Enguarded, and it's like, oh, you basically cannot counter it. But yeah, sure, but Enguard works the same way, and now you can kill a 5 HP unit because you deal 4, right? So you would have to combine that with Stupefy and stuff like that. So it's like, I don't feel like Decree of Rage is needed, but I see a lot of Kaisas play it. But yeah, personally think it's a little bit too narrow. Decree of Might on the other side is helping you with one of your really bad matchups, which is Master Yi, which could be relevant enough to justify the board slots in, for that specific matchup. Other than that, I already have spoken about the Brittle Steel and Thermo Beam thing. I would just prefer to have, like, I think 3 copies of Brittle Steel than having Thermo Beam, but that's my opinion, right? You don't have to agree with it. And yeah, Ferrous Furnace, I would definitely play 3. I think you need to cut, like, if you would be able to cut, like, Decree of Rages, add additional... Oh, wait, he has 3. Never mind. This deck actually has 3 Ferrous Furnace, so it's all good. Next tournament is gonna be Fuzhou City Challenge, which was also won by Kaisa, but also posted as 6th and a 7th place Kaisa, and also a 10th place. When it comes to the metagame breakdown, as you can see here, it's also a very popular choice, with Kaisa being the second one with 16 entries out of 128, while the most popular deck was Master Yi and Irelia, the 3rd choice. Kennen wasn't even, like, in top 4, he was actually the 5th one, right, with the 8 slots. But overall, let's take a look. The first place, very similar, doesn't play the Rockfall path though, so I actually scratched what I just said with very similar. It is similar, but not, like, it has very big changes. I think this is a mistake, not playing Rockfall path when you just play full 3 Temporal Breaches and even 2 Brynhirs. I think it's just weird. But at the same time, I do understand why, right? Because, as I explained, Irelia is a massive headache for Kaisa, so potentially this battlefield helps a lot. But again, I feel like just having 3 solid battlefields into every single matchup is just so much more important than just having potentially 1 battlefield happening with just a very, very small portion of the metagame, right? Because there's not that many deflect units in the metagame apart from Irelia and Vex, and I don't think, like, Nasus should be a consideration as a threat. It's like you're gonna pay that deflect and just temporal breach him when you play Brynhir, and it's gonna be like, whoopsie daisy, that's gonna happen a lot. Anyway, not many other changes in this particular deck. There's this perfect execution instead of Brittle Steel, and in the sideboard, again, the same discussion that we had before: Decree of Rages, Mites, Brittle Steel 2 times, no Thermo Beam, right? So that's something that I like. More retreats. I would say retreat is gonna be important in your mirror matches, for example, like very important actually, to avoid being blown out, right? And it allows you to replay more Brynhirs. That's something that can happen. So overall, that might be a decent choice in the upcoming metagame. 2 Time Warps. There's also, like, in previous metagame, one of the ways of winning against Irelia was playing for Time Warps. I do not know if this is still viable, because the Irelias are playing, like, a much different game now with, like, multiple Akali Silence. If I would play Irelia, I would legit just play 3 Akali Silence and 2 Twilight Shroud in the main board. And I don't think you would be able to win with just Time Warp's plan against that kind of build. So that's, like, my surface level analysis with 0 games on it. But anyway, that's the first place. Then on the 6th place, again, very similar, standard, like the battlefields, Rockfall Path, Void Gate, and Frozen Fortress. Not many surprises over here in the main board, apart from the fact that it's a little bit, let's say, bigger in the end game and smaller in the early game, right? Because we only have 7 2-drops, which is a massive change, right? Most of the Kaisers play 8 or 9. Then we have 3 Brynhirs, 2 Ferrous Forerunners in main, and 3000 Tail Watchers. So in theory, this deck is prepped more into the Master Yi matchup than the other ones, and maybe he thinks that he's good enough into the other matchups that it doesn't really care that much, right? So you have, like, there's, like, this deck is stacked in, like, very efficient answers. We have 2 Singularities, Temporal Breaches, Falling Stars, Hextech Rays, right? And then 1 Bellows Breath, 3 like, there's a lot of packed into this build specifically. So maybe it actually makes sense to play just 7 2-drops and not really, like, bother not hitting one. Like, it's okay if you don't hit one, that's okay. You still play very efficient deck that is just gonna get back into the game once you start bouncing and killing everything and not making it being replayable, right? In the sideboard, we have all the standard stuff. Again, not gonna repeat what I just said about Decrees, but there's Mel, which is helping you definitely against a Ezreal control, I would say, right? That's gonna be the one when you maybe will want to have it, because you're not gonna be able to, like, get hard bargained or abandoned, which are way more efficient than the green counter spells against you, right? Again, maybe actually, I'm trying just to find reasoning why would we like to play this, because I don't really like it. And there's Thermo Beam and Brittle Steel. Personally, I would prefer to have 3 brittle steels overall. And in the 7th place, same story, 8 2-drops, Pouty Poros though, instead of Plundering Poros, so no gold, but a Deflect, which kind of makes sense in the metagame where you expect a lot of Kaisas, I would say, right? But we have, this one is a little bit more efficient with the short, low-end buffs, right? So we have Bellows Breath, Cleave in 2, and Smokescreen in 2 copies as well, which is like you're setting yourself up a little bit better in the early game rather than in the late game, because you don't have like singularities, for example, in this deck, right? And then in the sideboard there are some really wild choices. Not having singularity in the sideboard, but having Caffeine Rain seems pretty odd, I would say, because singularity is single-handedly, beats like a setup of Diana into Hui. If your opponent just doesn't have any other option, and on turn 3 just play singularity and win the game, like on the spot, for example, which you can't do with a Caffeine Rain because it's gonna, 7 energy, like you can't, like you would have to go second, right? And then there's Immortal Phoenix, 1 copy, which is not a lot. Now the question is, how often do you side it in and which matchups? Because I feel like in the matchups that you would like to use Immortal Phoenix, you most likely are already favored. So Immortal Phoenix doesn't really change that much. And against Ezreal Control, which discards your card, and you would like to have recurring threats, you don't really have a lot of options when it comes to killing the opponent, because they're either bouncing the units or there's not a lot of units just built in, right? So I don't know, but if that would be a matchup I would side it in, I would probably say Ezreal Control and maybe Draven to some degree, but at the same time it doesn't really the unit doesn't really hold, right? So it's gonna just lose a combat, so I'm not entirely certain. Maybe against Cannon Miracle, no, against Cannon Miracle, no, never mind, because you get Starcross and you just cry. So yeah, I don't like this Immortal Phoenix in the sideboard, even though I absolutely love the card. Now I'm gonna go show you quickly the other top 8 decks from other city challenges, and they just don't really have that many differences. Like this one goes instead of Frozen Fortress for Heisho, which I think is actually the worst option, because why would you not want to play Frozen Fortress when you play 3 Brainhears, right? And then the Sprite Fountain allows you to be a little bit more aggro with the Sprite Burst as well, so this is like a little bit lower on curve and tries to be a little bit more aggressive with the possibility of getting points earlier. I'm not sure, I would not recommend this specific build myself, even though it looks a little bit better on paper because it's more consistent. I don't think it has enough power tricks to actually be as efficient. Also, this is the second time we're gonna see today Right of Conquest, which I don't think it's a good card, and this is the first time I'm seeing in Constructed. And if you don't know what it does, it allows you to draw a card and then draw cards for each battlefield that you control. So if you control both battlefields, you're going to be able to draw 3 cards. So this card is potentially only being played in decks that have like sprites, like this one, and then you play against very slow decks like Ezreal Control, maybe Aurora, and this is a way of you replenishing your hand. And like, for example, with Sprite Burst, you're essentially gonna go like 5 + 3, so you're gonna be able to draw 3 cards because your opponent doesn't control the battlefields, right? And for 8 energy, you get 2 points and draw 3 cards, which sounds powerful, right? But it's like, I don't know, it's probably hard to pull off. But also 2 Brittle Steels and 2 Thermo Beams. Whoa! But anyway, if this would be a Frozen Fortress, I would be actually way more inclined to like this deck, which is a very low bar of changes that you have to do, and this deck looks pretty sweet otherwise, right? So that's the one. Then we have this is Beijing City Challenge, 2nd place in the top 8. Again, not many differences, very stocky-like, but with 1 Ferrous Forerunner. There are 2 production surges to just create units. It has a possibility of being cheaper because of Forecaster, so I guess it makes sense. Like I explained before, the value I see in Predict of Eclipse. Now every single of your mechs has Predict, or Vision rather, and Forecaster like becomes way more efficient because of your Ferrous Forerunner and the production surge. It kind of makes sense. Like they become just lecturing Yordles. That's why we have less lecturing Yordles, but like the production surges. This is logical, I would say. I'm not saying I'm not a fan of this, but I see the vision. Haha! Yeah, anyway. So in the sideboard, more of the same, not much to talk about. Unchecked Power in 2 copies to help against hold decks like Ivan, which will have Million Deflect, and Vex, which also might have Million Deflect, so I guess Unchecked Power helps with that if you're worried about this specific matchup. Then 4th place in Wuhan, which again has the right of conquest and doesn't play Frozen Fortress, even though it has 3 Brain Hears and 3 Temporal Breaches. So yeah, also plays Decree of Rage instead of the blue decrees in the main board. Sorry, in the sideboard. Holy, not a fan of this. I would rather have the two blue decrees, I think, because the matchup against Master Yi is probably worse than the one where you would use the Decree of Rage, I would say, right? Even though it could help against Master Yi, but it's like, do you need help in killing the 2-drops? I wouldn't say so, right? And Decree of Rage on its own doesn't really help with Akali Silent, because it's not a reaction speed. If this would be a reaction speed, the conversation would be so much different, but it's not. The only possible way of dealing reaction speed damage is actually Shakedown, and we know that card is garbage. So anyway, hope you guys enjoyed this breakdown. Oh right, I also forgot there's also this Kaisa from this other tournament over here. This is 4th place, so let's take a look, and nothing special. But I hope you guys enjoyed this breakdown and quick analysis on why Kaisa is performing better. And my analysis here is that I think Kaisa could be a very decent choice for almost every single tournament apart from regional qualifiers. Although, sorry for that. Although I do think that if you want to go to a top 64 and you don't really care about like playing Master Yi, then Kaisa might also be a similarly good character to just choose for aiming for that top 64 because of the wide metagame like applications of your deck. So maybe scratch what I just said, and it should be decent into any tournament. So let me know if you're gonna try it out in any tournaments. Let me know how did you feel with playing this new version of Kaisa's. It's kind of refreshing to see how this old queen is getting a makeover, and it looks pretty cool. Not gonna lie, I kind of want to play it myself, so maybe I'll take it to a Nexus night next week and see how will it do, and I'll report back in a pinned comment under this video or on stream. If you enjoyed the videos that I'm doing, it would be awesome if you could leave a like under the videos, or maybe even a comment. I always respond to most of the comments that I get. And if you would like to go above and beyond and support me financially, there's a way of joining the memberships here on YouTube with 2 different tiers with different perks, so you can check out that, or just leave a sub on Twitch or on Kick. Thank you so much, my friends, and see you guys in the next video. Bye bye. Today's episode is sponsored by Elgato. Go to elgato.com for the newest hardware for streamers, use the link from the description below and the code for 5% off. Thank you, Elgato, for sponsoring this stream.